Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Supply Chain Risk Management Consortium's webinar on the transparency myth, why data alone never scales without trust. Before we begin, we want your perspective because the gap between data and decisions is exactly where the conversation lies. Please provide your thoughts throughout the webinar in the chat window. And we will, again, we'd be providing all the recording after the webinar and the slides within a week, as we always do. Please join us on the poll EV and say hello here where you're calling from. That would be wonderful. Just a test to make sure that you could get onto poll EV and so that we can uh, gain your insights for our polling question that's coming up. Drum roll for that. And when you are entering a phrase, just make sure you put an underscore between the words. It's a poll EV requirement. We haven't been able to convince them to do otherwise. So that's wonderful. Thanks for joining. That's great. Great to see all that action in the poll EV. Thank you. So with that, this webinar is focused on challenges. It really challenges the core assumption that more data drives better decisions. We often say we just need more data and we'll be able to get to the answer, especially with AI as popular as that is today. We just need more data. But where we're going to argue is what you really need is more trust. And if you don't have trust, then more data won't matter because if you don't have trustworthy data, then what are you making? How are you training your AI agent, or how are you training it? And so we will be focusing on trust today. And again, this is the first of a six-part webinar series. Uh, and again, we appreciate you joining today's webinar on building evolving resilient enterprise. That's our motto, and visualizing and synergizing on that end-to-end supply chain. So that's the underlying uh, theme here. And of course, with today's world, we hope that your family are healthy and safe. With that, what are we going to get out of this webinar? So we want to shift in how we think about supply chain transparency. Transparency is an overused word and has become a bit like uh, uh, almost meaningless over time as we obliterate words and slowly through acronyms and initiatives. So today we'll talk about why transparency initiatives plateau at tier one. That's tier one transparency in your supply chain. Very often you might be able to see your tier one suppliers. You might be able to see your customers. Generally, we can see more of our suppliers than our customers understanding, but why it plateaus there and why suppliers rationally withhold data. Why don't they share the data? I thought we were all one big family, right? And then how trust acts as either a tax or a speed dividend. We'll get into that a little bit and what we found from our 1 year research project with over 50 interviews and over 100 papers read and over uh, 10 or 15 interactive sessions with experts in the field. And what does it mean to engineer trust as a system capability? So that's what we'll be getting into in today's first of the series of webinars. With that, Greg,
Mhm.
we'll kick us off with the background of the consortium.
You bet. Pleasure to be here to talk to you about something completely different within the confines of supply chain risk and resiliency, and that is trust. This picture image is who we are and what we do. Just a real quick thumbnail sketch here. We are 33 companies, about 1,700 supply chain risk pros around the globe. We've been in business for 15 years. We run on three pillars, as you can see on the right. We do a lot of education. We do a lot of consulting where we lead, guide, direct, and coach companies. on their supply chain risk and resiliency journey, and now trust. And we have a host of software as a service companies who can do the heavy lifting when it gets into mapping global supply chains, using predictive analytics, and so forth, all in an effort to identify, assess, mitigate, and manage supply chain risks. Over on the left are our offerings. We have 2 certificate courses, self-paced. They've been around for 7, 8 years. One is geared towards manufacturers. The other is geared towards logistics and healthcare providers, healthcare logisticians. We have an online readiness assessment tool. There's a free portion of that on our website that evaluates your process maturity within your supply chain. We have another online assessment. It's called the 90-day action plan. It uses AI ML algorithms to identify where you are on our 5-stage maturity curve in terms of supply chain risk and resilience, who you are, risk appetite, what is your risk appetite in your company and your culture? And then we produce action items, and there's a free element of the maturity on our website as well. And then our third online assessment tool is now the Trust Acceleration Index, TAI. Reciprocal scorecard, we're going to talk about that. We're very excited about it. And again, we do coaching and consulting, and we have solution platforms to do the heavy lifting. So that's us. I'll turn it back to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. And as you know, Greg and I are joined at the hip. But my organization is Enhance International Group. We have about 80 partners covering people, process, data, and technology. And we work together to drive the overall strategy. And of course, today's strategy is trust acceleration. And it's all about creating that trust cadence throughout. So we have a number of partners in EIG that are partnering with the consortium to bring this all to life and so that you, the customer, can gain and maintain your competitive advantage and be faster than your nearest competitor. That's what it's all about, is building cadence and through trust. So, the way we look at it is sustained growth isn't driven by tools. It's driven by the decision velocity and what comes from trust. With that, we're going to get into our 6 webinar series. Today's webinar, of course, is the transparency myth and why data alone never scales without trust. Our next webinar coming up next month is the trust matrix, turning trust into a measurable, governable capability. Then we'll get into the trust acceleration index. What is that? And how it actually works to accelerate decision making. And then we'll get into the quality of interaction. It's not about the data, it's about the interaction. How do people interact with each other, and a way to assess that within your 4 walls and up and down your supply chain. That's the grease or oil that makes and lubricates your supply chain. And then we'll get into number 5, the N-tier supply chain transparency exchange that we built as part of this year-long project that I mentioned, and what trust preserving transparency actually looks like. We did a pilot on that, and we're looking again for, as in TAI, we're looking for more clients to go through that process. And then how do you scale this across this trust transparency up and down the supply chain from raw materials to end customer? So we'll get into a little bit of that. So that's our series. We hope you can join us for all the webinars. We're very excited to share this this information with you. So today we'll get into why transparency fails to scale, and then we'll get into common failure modes and traditional approaches. Most initiatives fail because they extract data without creating safety and reciprocity. And then we'll get into the trust constraints and what the research tells us. And trust is not driven by size, tenure, or power, we'll get into, but by consistent, predictable behavior. And then we'll get into introducing the trust matrix in this thing called PWG. We got to have acronyms, right? We brought new acronyms, performance willingness gap, and of course the trust acceleration index, TAI. To scale transparency, trust must become observable, measurable, and manageable. And then we'll have some key takeaways, a shift from managing data flows to engineering trust as a core operational capability. In summary, we'll explore why transparency fails to scale, and transparency stalls because the sharing requires trust. Trust doesn't scale by mandates. One of our favorites. So with that, we'll get into the first section of why transparency fails to scale, and Greg will kick us off.
You bet. Thanks a lot, Jim. We thought we'd start with a persistent question, and that is, if the data, supply chain data already exists, why do disruptions still cost us weeks and months? Well, a quick observation. We all have portals everywhere. We have dashboards everywhere. Yet decisions for us still stall at tier one. All right. We're very comfortable with our tier one suppliers. I'm not even sure, we're not sure we're that comfortable with our own customers, but that's a whole other webinar. The net of the question is, this is not a technology problem. It's a trust problem. All right. That's what we came up with after 12 months of a research project, and we're going to share more and more insights with you. So let's take a look at the next thread. And that is 3 terms to us that are not interchangeable. Transparency doesn't equal visibility. Visibility doesn't equal traceability. So let's talk about the 3. Transparency. Okay, it's available. What does that mean? Well, data is theoretically available somewhere in all of our systems. Okay, that's good. How about visibility? Is it usable? Data is it timely in context and actionable when I need it? And the third thread is traceability. Accountable. Is there lineage and accountability preserved across all your tiers in your supply chain? Those are actual questions that are asked every day. All right. The net is most programs stop at transparency and never reach visibility or traceability. All right. So, couple of questions, couple of terms, get you grounded. Next, the tier 1 ceiling. Why do mandates plateau at tier 1 in your supply base? Well, first and foremost, we got contract language. That doesn't really change behavior. You know, we all have contracts with our suppliers and our customers. Contract language does not drive the bus. All right. Next, we got reporting portals that favor large suppliers. And we understand why we do that, but it doesn't really play well with our smaller tier 2, 3, 4, and tier N suppliers. Another one, compliance is not the same as cooperation and collaboration. It's not. All right. We'll talk more about that throughout the webinar series. And finally, small and mid-tier manufacturers, we affectionately call them SMMs, they disengage rationally very quickly when there's no value, no trust, no collaboration. So the net on this thread is, and I think Jim mentioned it, mandates scale power, not truth. So we have some more for you. This one is very interesting. This one is something new, some new impacts relative to trust. We call it the trust tax and the speed dividend. Let's talk about trust tax first. If trust is low in your own organization or throughout your end-to-end supply chain, we think you pay the trust tax. What do we mean by that? Well, first and foremost, you're going to have to invoke manual validation of all the data, of all the discussions, and on and on and on. Next, it escalates delays. And in supply chain risk and resiliency, time is money. And then finally, the trust tax, it invokes defensive reporting. Why am I reporting to you upstream to my customer or my tier one? Because I have to keep getting the business. It turns into defensive reporting. Now let's talk about the other side of the equation, the speed dividend. If trust is high in your organization or within your supply chain, you earn what we call the speed dividend. What does that mean? Well, you get early signals of disruptions and problems, delays, and so forth. You get faster, you make faster decisions. And why is that important? Because in supply chain risk and resiliency, speed is life. And then finally, you realize lower disruption impacts because of early signals, faster decisions, collaboration, and trust. The net on this one, trust determines which one of these you pay. All right. So with that, I will turn it over to Jim.
Well, I'll turn it over to everybody else. I'll pass the buck here and ask folks to start entering in here. I think we seeded this a bit, that what limits transparency beyond tier one. These are some of the things we saw, but we would like to see either reinforced by entering in the same phrase or that you see up there with an underscore between words, or put new things up there. I see technology. Yeah, technology is supposed to enable it, but at the same time, it may be fragmenting it at the same time. So, um, Greg, your thoughts on anything here?
No, it's we've seen it all. One of the big ones is uh, system incompatibility. We've built out a host of trust factors, and that we'll get into during our 6 webinars. Wow, and many of them are right here. Data fragmentation, lack of transparency. We had I think it was something like 26 trust factors, Jim.
20, 25. And
25, yeah, and it's great. Great.
yeah,
There's some
and
right there.
there are there's some interoperability tended to be a pretty popular one.
Yeah.
If you were to take our online survey, and I will make sure that we send the online survey out that we used for the project for folks that they can enter in there and they'll gain a little bit insight into what we've done so far on trust. If they're interested in completing that survey, that'd be wonderful to up our database. But also, you can also glean some insights from there on the data elements as well as the trust elements are all contained within the survey. So, um, very good feedback here. And do we have any questions in the chat, Greg, that we should
No,
address?
just Chris mentioned it. He likes the trust tax versus the speed dividend.
Yeah,
That's
that is a pretty cool concept.
that is
Thanks.
kind of an epiphany for us. We
Yeah,
thought that was pretty good.
yeah. Thanks for reinforcing, Chris. Appreciate it. All right. With that, we'll keep going and we'll keep this open. So folks keep adding in the chat and adding into the word cloud here any additional, because we'll hit this one more time before we end the session. With that, I will move to the second section on common failure modes that we're seeing. Uh, there is a paradox. The more we invest in transparency, the more resistance we are often creating. If you've ever seen that happen, I think probably most of you can relate to that. We'll get into those common failure modes of traditional approaches. Well-funded programs increase resistance instead of insight. So we all see that where we set up this program and everybody says, "Oh, we're going to be able to see everything," and everybody shuts down. And we actually have less transparency. So let's talk a little bit more about what failure modes of tradition traditional transparency gets into. Extract data models. When data is demanded without reciprocity, so I want data from you, but you're not giving me data, what happens? Suppliers protect themselves by withholding insight, right? We've all seen that. I just want everything from you, but I'm not going to give you anything that you need or even ask, do you need? Do we ask our suppliers what they need from us? The next is analytics without governance. Insights create risk instead of value when no one defines how they will be used or controlled. So we've all seen that happen during these type of deployments. The next is the proverbial centralized data lakes. If we set up a data lake, we'll be able to answer everything. But aggregating that data centrally amplifies exposure fears, making participants less willing to contribute. So, you know, very often we start off by building these data lakes, and it is the right thing to do, but how do we manage the tension in the organization of what's shared and what's not shared? And the next failure mode that we've seen and shared from all those participants in our 1 year project is a one-way visibility demands. As I mentioned before, transparency forced in one direction erodes trust because it signals power, not partnership. So this whole idea of reciprocal uh, trust is absolutely key, and it was what we found. And so these increase resistance, not insight. So these are the pitfalls that you encounter in any ERP or any centralized data activity that you have done over the years, and why SMMs rationally withhold data. So, if you look at the supply chain, the SMMs are often at the end of the supply chain. You have maybe the government, then you have the OEMs, then you have like a tier one, tier three supplier, and then you got the SMMs. Sometimes the SMMs provide to the tier one to tier three, sometimes to the OEMs, sometimes directly, but they're kind of at the end, and they often are, are in fear of survival of their IP so that they can survive. So one of their top issues is the fear of misuse, uh, that the data will be used against them, and suppliers will limit what they share. The fear of repricing or transference of their products, so that they will use the margin pressure and information becomes a liability as we share our costing and our sourcing. So they don't want to share their coveted suppliers up to their customers, and the fear of punitive metrics. That's another one. If visibility leads to penalties instead of support, honesty disappears. So if there's the stick out there, then that's not going to really breed what you would like to like as a SMM. And then fear of permanent exposure. Once shared, data isn't taken back, so suppliers control risk by controlling access. So we've all seen that. So data withholding is a rational response to asymmetric risk. And again, you see fear all over the place here. Fear in all of our surveys was one of the most uh, widely expressed uh, comments during our surveys from all the folks, and especially the SMMs. So with that, we've talked about the trust constraints. So if technology isn't a constraint, what is it? And trust correlates to behavior, not hierarchy. So what research showed us is that trust is not supplier size. So it doesn't matter what size the supplier is, it's independent. Scale doesn't create trust, behavior does, right? Greg touched on that. Trust is not supplier tenure. So it's not dependent on how long that company is. The longevity does not guarantee trust. Consistency does. And as Greg often says, you can have 20 years of great relationships with a client or with a supplier or a customer, but one bad actor happens and you might as well start all over. You're not trusted anymore.
Mhm.
And then it's not contract, it's independent of contract language. I think Greg mentioned this. Power can enforce compliance, but it cannot create trust. So again, trust correlates to behavior, not hierarchy. So those are some of the things that came out in all those interviews. Very, very compelling from all those different suppliers at every, from to the government all the way down to is what we found across the chains that we. And so then we get into trust as a system capability. So when trust is embedded as part of the company's infrastructure. So if they have that infrastructure, then it determines speed. Then it can't be cultural. It must be engineered, measured, and governed. Trust is a system capability that is reflected in three areas that we'll cover here. Number one, it's built, not believed, engineered, not assumed. Trust doesn't emerge, it's intentionally designed into how organizations behave. Number two, quantified, not estimated, measured, not guessed. If you can't measure trust, you can't manage it. And its impact on speed and risk. So we all know what gets measured, get done. We all know that. And number three, owned but not wished. Governed, not hoped for. Trust requires clear accountability. Without ownership, it erodes. Right? We've all seen that. So in closing, trust is your infrastructure. It's not sentiment. It needs to be part of who you are as an entity. So with that, we'll just kind of wrap up the what limits trust or limits transparency beyond tier one today. Greg, any closing comments on this?
No, I like the additional threads of economic burden. What's the cost? We've seen and heard that. Lack of knowledge, data, a lot of data, but not actionable knowledge. We heard that throughout our 12-month research project. So thanks very much for giving us your first blush reaction to what limits transparency beyond tier one. Thanks a lot.
All right. Take it away, Greg.
Good. Yep. Our next section, we're going to introduce a couple of threads here. The trust matrix, PWG, and TAI. All right. And with that, I will tell Jim to roll the video.
Every year, supply chain disruptions cost the global economy hundreds of billions of dollars. Most organizations think the bottleneck is technology. It is not technology. It is not data. It is trust. The data often exists. The systems are already in place. What fails is the willingness to share forecasts, capacity, risk signals, and operational reality.
The strategic risks, which are geopolitical, violent weather, and so forth, they impact about 85% of all the negative financial impact across the world. Yet, chief risk officers only spend about 6% of their time on strategic risk. The trust adage that we hear all the time is it takes years to build trust and 30 seconds to kill it.
And once trust breaks, data stops moving. Visibility disappears. Blind spots become expensive. That is the problem the MXD Trust Matrix framework is built to solve. Developed through 9 months of primary research, more than 50 in-depth interviews, and over 200 survey responses across the industrial supply chain, it turns trust from an abstract concept into a measurable, actionable signal.
The whole premise of the project was, what will people share? What won't they share? And the biggie is, why won't they share it?
We get into the trust factors, and the first grouping is those basic needs. So like data accuracy, timeliness, compliance, security, all these things. These are the foundational aspects. And if it's missing, it's game over, right? The trust matrix turns trust from an abstract to measurable signals. It reduces those blind spots, improves agility, enables secure data across those tiers. And when we talk about tiers, we're talking about from government to OEM to tier 1 to 3 to SMMs. Modern supply chains have blind spots, so we want to ensure that data importance is high and the willingness to share it is low. We came up with this term called the performance willingness gap, which unlocks these blind spots. What data elements are we unwilling to share, and why are we unwilling to share from a trust perspective? That's what we're trying to get to in this trust matrix. You end up with what we call the Trust Acceleration Index Trust Score. And you'll have what you're doing well, what they're doing well, and vice versa, what they think, and where the gap is. 3 questions, 8 trust factors, 24 responses. Shouldn't take more than 10, 15 minutes to complete the survey. When we did our reciprocal scorecards, we just rocketed. Our profitability rocketed, our growth rocketed. Everybody wanted to work with us. We didn't even have to advertise. We had such a great reputation. It's a game changer. It's unbelievable what you're able to achieve. We just completely went from 35, 40% market share to 70% market share.
The framework is ready. The TAI score model is live. We are looking for alpha partners, manufacturers and suppliers ready to pilot the framework and gain first mover advantage in trust-driven supply chain collaboration. The survey takes 15 minutes. The insight lasts years.
Hopefully that gave you a thumbnail sketch of the trust matrix, the performance willingness gap, and the trust acceleration index, which is a tool which we will talk about in a minute. All right. So let's move on to some takeaways, and perhaps we'll answer any questions that you might have from the video as well. So one of the key takeaways is, I think we've talked about it, transparency can't be forced. It can only be engineered. All right. And to engineer that trust, all right, as Jim mentioned, it must first become observable, measurable, governable, and visible across the tiers. And I'll reiterate, remember, it takes years to build good trust in your supply chain. And as the video and what we heard and what we've seen is, it only takes seconds and minutes to destroy that trust. All right. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jim and talk a little bit about the TAI.
Thanks, Greg. And so what we set up here is just an overview of what the Trust Acceleration Index. We'll get more into this in the next webinars. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us and we can bring you up to speed with more of the overall offering. But it comes, what we were able to identify through all those interviews and assessments was that there were 25 trust factors. When we started the project, I think we could only kind of come up with maybe 4, maybe 6, Greg. And they weren't very clearly defined. So we have 25 trust factors that are defined. Those turn into the trust assessment. So the industry or the company, we have it by industry, but or it could be tailored by company to identify what are your, let's say, top 8 trust factors, because you can't do a detailed assessment on all 25. That's going to be unyieldy. So we have it as a 2-phase program. One is to prioritize the 25 trust factors along to your data elements that you use to run your company and how you have data that's transparent throughout your up and down supply chain. And then we get into that trust assessment, which takes about 10 to 12 minutes. And then we benchmark you, of course, through your industry to ensure that you know where you stand on trust relative to each other. So it's going to be interplay trust. So the applications are first within your four walls. A lot of the large companies that we've spoken to find that it would be good just to find out how well data is shared within the company. So if you take a multi-billion dollar company, very often we don't even share data well. So to get a good understanding of how the tool works and this approach works, we recommend doing it within the four walls. Of course, the next application is between the manufacturer and vendor. This is a traditional manufacturer-supplier relationship that we always talk about to reduce delays, eliminate misalignment, and attach to your vendor scorecard. So if you have a vendor scorecard program already established, this reciprocal trust survey is a great way to ensure you have trust. Again, this turns into a 30, 60, 90-day recommendation after your vendor and yourself fill out that survey as a manufacturer. Or if you're bold, you want to go downstream to your customer and you want to build more VOC type of arrangements, that this is a great tool to use there. And then you can use this up and down your supply chain even further. We are even talking to folks to use it with their transportation service providers. So if you have carriers moving your freight on the outbound side, let's say, that's very common. Inbound is generally covered by your vendor, but your carrier network, you can apply the same concept to it. So again, the goal is within the first trust survey, maybe 15 minutes, the second to identify your 8 trust factors, the second trust factor survey prioritization takes about 10 to 12 minutes. You'll get that immediate feedback and a 30, 60, 90-day action plan on how to remove the barriers that are clogging up your data exchange, which is the lubrication of your data to make you more effective in your supply chain. So the question is, okay, well, what do you get out of this? This is where we expect to see from what we've benchmarked and what we've heard of companies that are much better at this. And these are areas that we have seen that you could expect to gain performance in. You could take any one of these forecasting, if you don't have trustworthy data, of course, you're going to have unstable demand signals, and therefore you're going to be off in that regard. Stockouts is another one. That's actually we often don't have good trust in the data up and downstream. So, Greg, you want to pick one or two and talk about them?
Well, I just want to reiterate and maybe give the folks a mantra of what we've seen and heard from folks like Stephen Covey from our 12 months of research. And that is, when your trust is high, folks, your costs decrease in your supply chain and your speed of activity increases. So costs go down, speed of activity increases. Speed is life in supply chain risk and resiliency. The net is, we think that is a strategic advantage for you.
Great, Greg. Yeah, and I think that feeds directly into how these metrics will get better because you have that speed. So with that, Greg, you want to close us out on engagement?
Yeah, well, you bet. We'll close you out a little bit. Talk a little bit about maybe you're noodling on it. How do I engage with Greg and Jim and the consortium? As the video mentioned, we're looking for alpha testers. We're looking for alpha free testers. All right. So we have our email addresses inside of this slide deck. And down on the bottom, you can click on the Trust Acceleration Index URL. That is on the website, and on the bottom right, you can also get into the SCRM Consortium website for inquiries. Fill out a form, and we'll get back to you rather quick. So we're looking for alphas, and why? Because if you're an alpha, you're going to get some early benefits. You're going to be able to evaluate and score your risk, and then hopefully shape and redesign and improve your risk. And the net is we've found and agree and believe collaborative nature within the supply chain is really fosters trust building. So again, reduce the costs, increase the speed of activities. That net to us is a strategic advantage. So we wanted to just give you a sense of how to engage with us as an alpha for free. So what did we learn today? We'll kind of wrap it up. 4 shifts, Jim talked about them. Why transparency initiatives plateau at tier 1? Because mandates do not work. The next thread we hit was why suppliers rationally withhold data. Jim mentioned it. The actual video mentioned it. It's fear of misuse of my strategic data. The next one was how trust acts as either a tax or a speed dividend. That's a very new concept in our opinion. And the question is, what path do you want to follow within your supply chain? And finally, we talked about what it means to engineer trust as a system capability. I think the video really brought that message home. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim.
Thanks, Greg. And we welcome you to the next webinar. We don't have a date yet, but we'll be announcing that date here in the next week or two for the next month's webinar, probably towards the end of the month, I would imagine, end of June, the way it works out, because in the first few weeks we're out of town. So we look forward to having you join the webinar, and if you have any questions or comments on deploying this, or you want to participate in our alpha or our survey to get a understanding of what trust is and how we're looking at it and how it can help embed your organization to perform at a higher level. That's what this is all about. We would certainly appreciate your participation and look forward to it. So with that, Greg, any closing comments before we wrap it up here?
Just another thread of you can contact myself or Jim with the emails on the back slide and the first slide, and also now with the URLs. So we're very excited about this new thread within supply chain risk and resilience, and we actually think that trust is going to be the new catalyst and the hinge for good supply chain performance and good risk management going forward. So thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks everyone for joining. We look forward to seeing you again. My message here is, remember the core message, right? Data alone doesn't scale. Trust does. It pulls your company of people, process, data, technology, our mantra. If you don't have those, you're not going to survive. And all transparency depends upon the one agreed upon principle. Without trust, the platforms, whatever technology you have, is not going to be effective. And we all want to, I know there's a lot of technology providers out there, as well as practitioners of basic principles. It's only when we all work together that we can address the trust issue, so that we can share data up and down the supply chain to make our defense industrial base as fast as possible, so that we can be the most effective as possible. With that, I'll close it out, unless there's any questions in the thanks everyone for your kind comments in the chat, and we look forward to seeing you next time.